Welcome everybody, and thank you so much for taking the time to join our symposium this afternoon. Present is Dr. Famina Saeed. I think some of you may have met her before, some of you haven't. So just let me introduce Dr. Saeed is the head of our research institute and is working very hard to support students who are coming to really the end of their dissertation research on the DBA program, to help them identify areas of their DBA that they're able to spin out into publications. Speaking of which, we have one student today, Mr. Daniel Helmig. Daniel is coming to the end of his research and has already published. And we, upon having conversations with him, found out that he has a really interesting background. He's been involved with a number of pretty significant corporations in his past career, such as Ford, PepsiCo, Union Bank of Switzerland. And we've asked him to very kindly give up his time to come and speak to us on his experiences, particularly in and around leadership. So Daniel, without any further ado, I will pass it over to you. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you very much, Stuart. I am looking forward to have that discussion with you all. So thank you, Dr. Cooley. Thank you, Dr. Seed, for giving me the opportunity to hold that symposium. And for those willing to give up 1 hour on a Sunday, welcome to about 50 minutes of a walk through the last 4 decades of leadership evolution with lessons from global operations from my perspective. Here's what you can expect. We'll start with a short overview of the wider context of this period. Then we'll dive into a few stories that I believe are as relevant today as they were when I experienced them. These stories describe situations that in different environments can be new to you as they were to me when it happened. Reinhard Koselleck, who is a German historian, called this multiple temporalities, where elements of different periods coexist in the same moment. I will refer to that several times today in some of the lessons. In the end, I'll share some of the recommendations from my perspective for emerging leaders based on both my work life and most recent developments. And before we get started, a quick safety announcement. This is not a slow presentation. I will talk a lot about very different aspects of leadership and knowledge, so grab your favorite mug, settle into your comfy chair, and ride me through the next 4 decades. Here's a bit of context about my background. So I had the privilege of living in 4 countries, working in 48 countries, and sourcing from 123, which has certainly shaped how I view global operations. I give you this overview so that you can decide whether you can believe me in my reflections or think that I'm smoking something. I spent 20 years with Ford, starting with 23 years in material planning, since marketing job that was offered to me suddenly was cut due to budget constraints. So that was my career going in a different direction. Then procurement, change management, product development, and mergers and acquisitions integration. I actually left a bank job that I joined after my military service to start at Ford, when they promised me not to only pay me, but sponsor as well my vocational and BA studies in Germany. Funny enough, my last corporate job was also in a bank, 2 bookends over nearly 40 years. At Infineon Technologies in Munich, I worked as a chief procurement officer and supported a large divestiture and significant outsourcing in Asia. We had production in Germany, USA, Singapore, Malaysia, and China. At ABB in Switzerland, I became head of supply chain management, functionally leading about 5,000 procurement and 2,000 transportation and logistics experts. In addition to running the operation, I worked with other functional leaders to create a 7,000 people strong global service operation across India, China, Mexico, Poland, and Estonia. My circle of influence grew then there when I became head of operations and quality for all of ABB. That's 50,000 manufacturing employees, 250 plants, and a similar number of massive construction sites like dams, platforms in the ocean, or new power stations in the Amazon. We operated in 120 countries, and ABB was, and in some parts still is, comparable to Siemens and GE in the power distribution automation circles. My responsibility expanded again when the CEO and the supervisory board put me in charge of the company's most significant transformation. More about this later. After leaving ABB, PepsiCo hired me as their global CPO. Later, Credit Suisse, now UBS, in Switzerland, hired me as their CPO to evaluate and execute a business process outsourcing project. I have 2 grown sons, 1 wife, and I'm married since 33 years. Now, leadership never happens in isolation. The decisions we make and the transformations we lead are always influenced by broader context. As Newton's cradle shows, one ball's movement inevitably affects the others. Throughout our discussion, we'll look at how balls like geopolitical shifts, technological changes, and evolving management thinking have impacted corporate leadership via constraints or opportunities. Understanding this in a wider context isn't that not just background noise. It's often what determines whether strategies succeed or fail. So, before I talk about lessons and story from these years in leadership from my perspective, I'd like to go with you in the wider context and see what all happened at the same point in time. Otherwise, I fear that the 40 years across 5 decades will only be assessed through our lenses that we have today. When I look at the time interval, it reminds me of a very slow-moving cradle of massive proportions. Its movement was in one direction in the 80s and 90s, halted around 2000, and switched to the other side in 2010 and 2020. More about this later. The question for all of us is whether it continues to travel in one direction, whether it might turn again, or falls completely apart, as so many times in history, with all balls falling off for a while, as it did in the first half of the last century, for example. Final note. I'm fully aware that most of the context I present is Western biased. But since I have only just 1 hour, forgive me for concentrating mainly on European and North American zones, plus later China and India. While the political and digital transformations during this time would be very different, looking at from the African continent or the remaining parts of Asia, I'm sure that the lessons and stories will still apply. In the 1980s, when we look at political transformation in this wider context, the Cold War was still ongoing. Major conflicts like Vietnam, Korea, and the Cuban Missile Crisis were history. But a thriving Soviet Union, when I started at Ford, was still going on and remained behind an iron curtain. In the rest of the world, then now slowly economic liberalization started, which was like a first breath of fresh air for us. When we talk about the age of economic liberalization, we're referencing to a significant shift in economic policy, and that occurred mainly at the beginning in the United States under Ronald Reagan and in the United Kingdom under Margaret Thatcher. Key characteristics included deregulation, privatization, tax cuts, reduced government spending, free trade, and anti-union policies. The shift represented a major departure from the Keynesian economic models and policies that were dominating since post-World War II. The 80s liberalization were heavily influenced by economists like Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek, who had advocated for free markets with minimal government intervention. Sounds a little bit familiar, right? The 1990s saw the fall of the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall, which actually ran not just through Berlin, but 96 miles through my whole country. And for a brief moment, there was this feeling of peace. I still remember the day the wall fell. I had friends over, and when we sat in front of the TV and watched the pictures of East Germans embracing West Germans, for the first time in my life, I had tears in my eyes for a country that so far I could not identify with based on our past. The phrase, the end of history, made the rounds, which was, like most predictions, utter nonsense in hindsight. Still, with globalization following, everything seemed possible. Just look at the organizations that we now take for granted and that were actually created at that point in time. The establishment of the European Union happened in this decade. The introduction of the euro, NAFTA, the establishment of the World Trade Organization, and clearly the rapid globalization of supply chains and manufacturing. By the 2000s, the pendulum started to travel less quick, and due to the shifting grounds on which it was standing. We saw the rise of China as an economic and military challenger to the US, the emergence of regional powers demanding greater influence. 9/11 happened, and its focus on terrorism, US wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, growing importance of non-state actors, international institutions suddenly looking left and right and struggling to adapt to this multipolar reality, and climate change for the first time was being framed as a security challenge. The 2010s then saw the pendulum swing back as the area of carefree global trade and regional associations slowly eroded. We witnessed Brexit, Trump's America First policy, resurgence of nationalistic parties in Europe and India, growing anti-globalization sentiment, the first US-China trade war, tech nationalism, supply chain security concerns, the China's Belt and Road Initiative, and social media amplifying polarization. And in our current 2020s, the pendulum continues swinging in the same direction with disruptive events like COVID-19, Russia-Ukraine war, Hamas-Israeli conflict, rise of India clearly as a geopolitical power now, energy price total volatile, record government debt levels, supply chain disruptions, and heightened discussions around racial and social justice. Now, this change could not happen if not fueled by something new, and that was the digital information transformation. I had my first computer in 86, an IBM AT5172 with an Intel processor 8286. It had 6 megahertz processor, a RAM of 512, and my storage was 1.2 megabyte on floppy disks. I used it for online banking, reading first news sites, and playing games. I guess not much has changed, I think. While most predictions at this point in time were totally off, one prediction from 85 still holds true. The paperless office is as likely as the paperless toilet. Yeah? It was done by Alan Sugar, Amstrad founder, a company that does not exist but produced computers at that point in time. Now, in the 1990s, did you know that every major European country had its own version of the internet? Minitel in France, BTX in Germany, which I used heavily. They were all overtaken by the US internet version, which was cheaper, open source, more powerful, and decentralized. The 2000s brought then Web 2.0, suddenly no longer top to bottom information and content generation, but as well user content generation, crowdsourcing capability, and the first appearance of cloud technology. By 2010, cloud computing had become very strong with all data in one place. And there was now the opportunity to analyze it. Hence, big data was the expression in all books and discussions. In the 2020s, then, we saw, or we're seeing right now, the AI revolution, and many see that for the first time as a revolution on equal terms to the first industrial revolution. And digital integration, which is for the first time now seamless connectivity between previously separate digital systems, AI, IoT, cloud, 5G, and even digital twins representing physical systems in manufacturing make it now possible to make production optimization so much more easier. Now, each era requires different leadership approaches, from managing technology adoption, harnessing data, to today's challenges of human-machine collaboration. The most effective leaders I've known were not necessarily technical wizards, not at all, but those that understood how technology could transform. For me, that meant technology was, and will be just a tool. The real question is what we're doing with it. When we look at wider context, we as well have to look at management theories. Yeah? When you look between 80s and 2025, it has evolved remarkably over these decades. So if you look at them, you can see certain tendencies. In the 80s, we talked about operational efficiency through total quality management, lean production, and systematic removal of waste, influenced clearly by Japanese manufacturing, which at some point in time was actually founded by Ford Motor Company, or Ford. In the 1990s, the rise of agility, knowledge management, and organizational learning as competitive advantage in increasing complex environments. We had to. there was no alternative. Suddenly you had a vast organization which was connected with all sorts of countries, which before were more or less just managed regionally. And you needed to basically get the information across. So that was important. In the 2000s, then, the emphasis on human capital, talent management, and emotional intelligence, recognizing people as a primary differentiator in value creation. That was not just for fun. That was the problem, that suddenly these people were traveling when you had a global organization or selling to global organizations across the board, and you could not manage them in this style that you had before. So you had to let them go, and you needed to make sure that wherever they were, they actually were doing what they were supposed to be doing. So, hence, from the selection process and how you trained them, we got into a completely new kettle of fish. In the 2020s, as we all know, we talk now about stakeholder capitalism, no longer just shareholder capitalism, and purposeful business integration of profitability with sustainability, inclusion, and societal impact, which we know as ESG. Well, that's the political correct version. I call it the motherhood in apple pie story. Because since the 2010, we also see the rise of sovereign management theories, emphasizing national self-interest, resource control, and organization loyalty over global integration, characterized by reshoring, critical production, technological protectionism, state intervention in strategic sectors, suspicions of international expertise, preference of domestic solutions, and rejections of global standards in favor of local control and autonomy. These books are as well written, and there is no right or wrong, it's just different. The pendulum swings. So the half-life of management theories has shortened considerably. What worked brilliantly 3 years ago might be outdated tomorrow. The wisest leaders approach these theories not as gospel, but as tools again in a growing toolkit. And yes, I've witnessed over the 40 years as well plenty of management contexts that completely crashed against the hard rocks of reality. Um, just read the book on Good to Great by Jim Collins and the story behind that, and you know what I talk about. And it's not the only book that we had there, or theory. Now, based on this stroll that we have now taken through the last decades, giving a little bit of context, let's jump into the reflections on things you might still find beneficial. While they're contextual, they can apply still as well due to this concept of multiple temporalities to us today and maybe in your work life or whatever you do. I've chosen them from trainings I give to corporates, and I had to whittle down them. So due to time constraints, so only a few stories made it in. So there's probably one story per decade that we're going to discuss. Ford. Yeah, I was there about 20 years. So in the first 2 decades of Ford, they coincided with the fundamental changes I described, but as well in automotive manufacturing. Vertical disintegration of manufacturing. We were suddenly spinning off large portions of Ford, called Visteon, GM called it Delphi, new companies that were raised. And then suddenly system integration remained as an important context for the OEMs. We needed to be able to still build cars while the people that were building it were no longer inside of our company. And I can tell you at the beginning that didn't really work that well, and customers were not happy. The emergence of low-cost sourcing in Asia started. China, Eastern Europe as well, and clearly as well Mexico with their maquiladores, where in all these locations I traveled a lot and as well looked for suppliers and managed them. Global platform strategies with local adaptations suddenly were needed. VW started with it, Toyota did a great job, and Ford as well later on, which was now suddenly needed because clearly you had the opportunity to look over many different countries where before it was more regional. When I joined Ford, I thought that Ford was more or less a German company. Can you imagine? So at some point in time, I was even in charge from a procurement side for a platform that produced 1 million vehicles per year across Ford of Europe, US, Volvo, and Mazda. And just to be clear, the Volvo engineers were the most complicated. The Japanese were a breeze. Leadership lessons from this period included managing cross-cultural global teams, as communication information exchange was not possible and much quicker, with the internet and everything that was coming up, emails and digital attachments, everything was there already. My first supervisor in Europe was a Spaniard, was a Spanish guy. We both had very limited English, and it was fantastic because he did not call me, I did not call him, because we know that we did not understand us anyhow. In this context, I only can recommend to see cultural differences holistically, not as something to absorb and hope that if you work with the colleagues, you somehow get it, like with osmosis. Like languages, cultural differences can be learned. One great book that I gifted to most of my leadership teams over the years was The Culture Map by Aaron Meyer. At the end, there's as well a link to that. Balancing standardization with brand differentiation was another thing. When you suddenly have access and transparency to global production, you see all the production across the whole globe. By default, you see massive waste and duplication. So what do? You start to standardize. But suddenly products start looking the same in the US, Europe, and Asia, and the customers were not amused. Creating value through strategic sourcing innovation was then something in my neck of the woods. Ford went through a phase of buying various brands to enter into the upper car segment at that point in time, calling it Premier Automotive Group. It was Aston Martin, Jaguar, Land Rover, Lincoln, Volvo. All these brands were under our umbrella. I was in charge to come up with a model that makes us all sing in a choir in procurement instead of individual prima donnas. I succeeded with a team of people in the UK, and later this model was actually implemented worldwide at Ford. But as the pendulum tended to change direction later under the One Ford strategy, they dismantled this whole group by selling all of the luxury brands again. Today, these brands are still alive and kicking, like Aston Martin, which you will see once again in the next James Bond movie, or owned by Indian and Chinese conglomerates and producing some damn good vehicles, I might add. Now, here the first little story about my time when we were growing internationally and were sourcing as well more in other countries, like here for China. In 1988, I traveled to Shanghai for supplier meetings in Zhuzhou, and at that point in time, it revealed minimal traffic, with a few exceptions on this new highway that they built between Shanghai and Zhuzhou. Local farmers actually used the highway as well, together with oxes and horse carts. They preferred the left lane. So when we were driving there full speed, that was a little bit complicated. And later on, I learned the reason why they choose the left lane is that in between there was this green belt and the animals munched on it. 2 years later, the cars were gone. The trip took 1.5 hours in the most comfortable Western sedans already assembled in China at that point in time. 3 years after that, severe traffic jams. It was massive. The journey took about 3 hours. Today, traffic is completely fluid and complemented by a super 30-minute high-speed train connecting the cities. Every aspect of life and business interaction moved at lightning speed. Hotels appeared out of nowhere. You traveled once, there was no hotel. You traveled again, there was a hotel. In one of my first trips, I was in one hotel which was still new, and so no elevator worked, and my furniture in the room was still bubble wrapped. The owner actually had put a big stack of money on the table and asked the hotel chain to build it for him. Electricity was provided often for free by municipalities to attract businesses. Villages around factories were created to house migrant workers that came in winter to work and earn good money and disappear in their local villages in springtime to work on farms and provide food for their families and elders. At the end, the change from agricultural to industrial was not completely done in China and still is to some extent not done, and maybe it's a good thing. Traffic was completely chaotic, but food was, as always in the world, fantastic. Today, China has high-speed trains, largest accumulation of solar panels and windmills in the world, brilliant electrical cars, 160 cities with over 1 million people. Out of these, Chongqing has 31 million, Shanghai 24, Beijing 22, and in comparison, New York has 8.4 million in its city limits. For me personally, my Chinese team were the absolute superstars. If I needed to try out something new in process or training, I asked them to test it. They excelled in most things before the Western counterparts even had read the manual. Why? Because they were used to constant and drastic change, and it was a new normal for them, so they had not a problem, and they were good. The point for me is, if governments and business leaders put their mind to it, everything is possible. Even tremendous change does not have to take decades in a country or company level. If it can happen quickly. It can happen quickly, but only if you want it. What I like are 1,000-day rules. Set a target for 1,000 days, it's approximately 3 years, and every initiative loses after that its appeal for people because they move on and give up on our board. So be quick, implement, and move on with the next 1,000-day project if you want. After automotive, I moved, as I mentioned, to semiconductors at Infineon Technologies from 2009 to 14, an industry characterized by Moore's law, relentless pace. Moore's law dictates that the number of transistors on a microchip doubles approximately every 2 years, increasing computing power exponentially while costs are halved. This principle, which was coined by the Intel co-founder Gordon Moore in '65, has served as both prediction and a goal for the semiconductor industry since. The capital intensity was staggering. I don't know whether you know about that. At my time, when I was at Infineon, a front-end plant from a semiconductor sector was costing about 1.5 to 2 billion US dollars, and that was for 8 nanometer wafers. Today, a modern leading edge semiconductor fabrication costs 15 to 20 billion a pop. And for chips that are now with TSMC, that are working on 2 nanometer, the Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing company, the facilities are estimated at 20 billion a factory. In comparison, an automotive assembly plant costs about 1/10. We've seen the massive rise of specialized manufacturers like TSMC, founded by the state of Taiwan, which now captures about 80% of the industry profits. Let me repeat that. TSMC has 80% of the semiconductor industry's profits. If you're interested, listen to the Acquired podcast episode on TSMC, including eventually as well the follow-up session with their founder, Morris Chang, who spent the first 25 years with Texas Instruments before joining TSMC. At the time of the interview, by the way, last year, he was 93. My team had several strategic shifts, or led several strategic shifts. Once I adopted the automotive style category management, which was another case of multiple temporalities, because what I knew for decades in automotive was completely unknown in the semiconductor supply chain. We implemented strategic make versus buy decisions and outsourced left, right, and center many back-end manufacturing plants to suppliers, Malaysia, Singapore, China, as we grow as well so rapidly that brick and mortar investments made little sense cost-wise. The digital procurement capabilities that I was mentioning beforehand now had an interesting topic in terms of you could now start to have, for example, security for plants. They were run remotely from Germany, everywhere in the world. And I could sit at my table and monitor production batches in real time in Malaysia and at TSMC. We introduced proper competitive scenarios with suppliers, and that was a completely new supplier relationship model for Infineon because they beforehand had very cushy relationships with suppliers. They called it strategic partnerships, which in my opinion only means I pay more. There's no such thing as a strategic partner. Either there's a strategic relationship or a romantic partner. You have to choose which you go for. For me, when we went on, I introduced proper competitive scenarios by creating, for me, the leadership challenge was transforming procurement from a tactical to a strategic function. Infineon had incredible smart people. because the company was producing on the wavelength of light, with a hiring policy of getting the best, not only in engineering, but as well in commercial departments. So knowing I had a lot of brainiacs around me, I created a comprehensive guide on strategic category management and market management, 250 pages, hundreds of PowerPoint slides, and many, many meetings later. Everyone intellectually understood the approach, and their implementation was smooth due to the exceptional talented procurement team that I had, which was fascinating to do work with. Now another story, and that covers both and even today a couple of different areas. I've observed a fascinating pattern, which I call "they can never be that good" syndrome. In the late 1990s, when I was in the automotive or European automotive boardrooms, completely dismissed Korean manufacturers, convinced that companies like Kia and Hyundai couldn't produce affordable cars or attract European customers. Surprise, surprise, today, Korean OEMs are between 3 and 5 in the selling charts in Europe. In 2007, semiconductor executives similarly dismissed Samsung's ambition for being a market leader here. While Western executives doubted, Samsung at that point in time invested just the petty cash of 5 billion in new plants, eventually driving prices down so dramatically that Western DRAM manufacturing, that's the little chips that we have in terms of memory, virtually disappeared. By 2015, European and US automotive firms, at that point in time I was at ABB, believed they would maintain dominance in robotics against Asian competitors no matter what. Yet by 2017, 90% of companies, for example, at the Beijing Robotics Show, were Chinese firms, and they were fantastic. Now today, Chinese automotive OEMs are entering Europe with brilliant and highly competitive electrical vehicles, and guess what? The voices in industry and media are again similar to the past. Each case reveals the same bias. Incumbents underestimating emerging competitors until it's too late, but it's as well a story about hubris and cultural prejudices. And it happens then, it happens now, all the time. Only the players change. The lesson is not just about competitive awareness, but the danger of letting cultural assumptions cloud strategic judgment. One board member at one time told me in the corridor after one of these meetings, perhaps we are asking the wrong questions here. Instead of, can they be that good? We should have asked, what if they are? Yeah? And here my computer is playing on me. Here we go. Now, ABB. My 11 years at ABB involved leading transformation at a massive scale with a power and automation leader operating in, as I mentioned, 120 countries and 160,000 employees. To be brief and get to the stories, here are just the cliff notes. When I came, every business unit and country had their own procurement team, but as well a marketing team, sales team, whatever, with little to no interaction when I joined. It was crazy for me. We consolidated all category teams in my organization in massive sessions with representatives from all organizations, ensuring that the message was loud and clear. It was kind of like a conclave. Based on that, we moved from $300 million of savings on the $16 billion spend to $1 billion per year, verified by finance. For the operations and quality role that I later had, I had to make a strategic choice, either lead on operation or lead on quality. Since this was a functional leadership position, I decided on building competence, leaving operations optimization to the units. We took an internal quality system and transformed it into a powerhouse of Lean Six Sigma, which was like 30 years old at that point in time in terms of the strategy, right? We developed hundreds of black belts, thousands of green belts, and nearly everyone in manufacturing of these 50,000 people had to become a yellow belt. Customers loved it. And we shifted our focus to the voice of the customer rather than the voice of the superiors or hippos. And if you don't know what hippos is, I recommend that you read the evidence-based management book that is part of the curriculum that we have here in UBIS. ABB taught me that transformation isn't a one-time event, but a continuous process of adaptation. And yes, sometimes that means admitting previous transformation didn't achieve what they were promised. But before we get to this story, I'd start on something which is rather something near and dear to this institution, which is competence and training. When I joined ABB, as part of getting to know the organization, which you should always do when you get into a new organization, first to talk to everyone and their grandmother, right? I asked for the trainings available to the team. There were typical corporate trainings, which means boring, too long, unengaging, old content, and done by employees with no didactical training. Locally, there was a lot of training given since training organizations were country-based. But every country or business taught what their leadership thought was good. And some was, and most of it actually wasn't. Competencies were not defined. Job profiles were miserable. There were even differences between roles that sounded the same. So you could have a buyer A, a buyer B, and they were doing completely different things. The attitude in the teams were, we do not need training at all. We learn by doing. And I often ask them why on earth they even send their kids to school. It's a medieval tribal thinking. Learn from the elders and what the village knows rather than what the world knows. This thinking was prominent in so many companies, and even today, many HR functions have only a reductive idea about competency profiles linked to job requirements, competency assessments, and progression-focused training. Hence, many managers see their team's capabilities as a snapshot, rather than a group of talents that need development to get to the best of their abilities over time. Now, in the end, I took a manager with brilliant knowledge and made her the head of competence in my organization. She hated the idea because she left what at that point in time was a real job, a strategic buyer job, and do something that no one then saw as needed. We developed competency profiles by job positions, created a competency assessment to help employees to see where they had gaps. And at the end, we even did this with big data using Korn Ferry a couple of years later. We started small by letting the top managers in our functions develop a training which was quality checked and then implemented by them. So they needed not to only manage, but as well to train. And more trainings were created. At the end, we created a standard global catalog with finally 144 trainings about every aspect of competency required from former 3. And they were face-to-face and online trainings. One of our team leaders was a Bond fan. So instead of license to kill, we created something which we called license to buy curriculum with tests and career progression thresholds to make sure that when you actually had the ability to spend like millions of dollars of our money, you at least knew how to do that right. To our overall pride, the competency team won global awards against Google, Microsoft, and Siemens, among others, for employee development. Our people were dangerously good. It was a pleasure to see them in action. But everything flows, and the pendulum swung back after I left. Why? I will explain in my last story about ABB. Since the '88 formation through a merger of Swedish ASEA and Swiss Brown Boveri, ABB had acquired 44 companies, creating enormous complexity. We had, by the way, 220 different ERP systems, just to give you a feel for that. Around 2009, a board member, later CEO, implemented a more centralized organization structure. So over 10 years, this approach centralized functions and established huge global service centers, which I referred beforehand, all layered on top of an existing regional and divisional structure. The internal metrics look brilliant. Yet remarkably, the company's share price stayed flat at around 19 Swiss francs throughout the whole period. Eventually, facing investor pressures, the board made a dramatic pivot and decentralized into business units, essentially returning to the former acquired company structure, and all based on as well academic research. In 24 months, and that was my job to actually get this done, so I was the leader of this change, we moved a 3-dimensional Rubik's Cube matrix organization to a no matrix organization using academic studies from Harvard Business School, a guy named David J. Collins, and later as well University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. They have analyzed 600 companies to determine optimal headquarters size in a study called the Size, Structure, and Performance of Corporate Headquarters, which is brilliant if you are owning a company or you work in a company and you try to figure out, how do I set up myself best? This shift prioritized clearly competency, speed, and customer focus over now economies of scale that everyone thought was the best thing. Transformation moved quickly. Remember my 1,000-day rule, reducing headquarters staffing by 90%. 13,000 people moved out of headquarters. All expected savings were achieved. Fiduciary responsibilities across 120 countries were completely changed because now suddenly we put it all in a no matrix organization. And before the Liberation Day of USA this year in April, the share price of ABB had reached 54 Swiss francs, about 2.5 times what it was during the time then we had these wonderful economies of scale kind of setup. As a former centralist who had worked for 30 years in centralized or hybrid organization structure, I was totally flabbergasted, even though I led the change. But I had to finally agree with the slogan, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Now, when I was done with ABB at 58, I was ready to call myself done with corporate life. I had my Harley Road King at that point in time, many friends, my wife, and I wanted to travel, and I was planning a consultancy already then. It was in the midst of the pandemic when I received a call from an executive search firm asking if I'd be interested to join PepsiCo as their CPO and move to New York. My wife and I were attracted to the idea because, well, A, culturally, B, the food is very good, and we were empty nesters. So I sold my T-Bird and Harley, installed remote controls in our house, and worked on US hours, so 2 p.m. to 10 p.m., from my basement office for 6 months until my O visa was approved. During this time, we implemented several initiatives. A comprehensive organization redesign. You see a pattern here about my career, I think. Analyzing performance, budget, actuals, spans and layers, and benchmarks, for example, in procurement, that's personal, per spend and procurement. Plus communication patterns between organizational leaders. Now, you might wonder what that is. It's a little bit Big Brother. It's taking the communication, the emails that are sent between different people and analyzing them. And it was interesting to see that people that were paid for having global roles didn't really talk with other people in global roles or in other areas. And that, however, people in the organization was talking to everyone because they had to basically get into the void that was done by the leaders. We doubled minority sourcing targets following the unfortunate George Floyd's death in the aftermath of this murder and the Black Lives Matter protests. Most US companies reevaluated their policies. As PepsiCo ranked at that point in time 44th in the Fortune 500, I realized that our minority sourcing volume with Black-owned US companies was improvable compared to our customer demographics. We doubled the targets and ensured that PepsiCo, previously completely missing from minority sourcing associations, got a seat at the table to support these communities. I was also dissatisfied with our US organization's demographics. After discussions with the broader organization, I created an internal minority council and brought the first African-American female onto my leadership team. Later, when I left, I recommended her as my successor, and thankfully, the PepsiCo leadership team followed my advice, and she became CPO. Being a European and raised in a multicultural environment, I value diversity as a major driver for excellence. And it doesn't really matter whether it's diversity of race, gender, population group, and clearly as well thought. Now, why did I leave after everything was set in motion and my O visa was granted in November? If I ask everyone here and everywhere about their highest priorities and values, probably 90% of you would say family comes first, right? It's the same with me. But in reality, I've dragged my family to every country I worked in. My children changed schools multiple times. My wife had to build up new connections every time that we moved, and our parents rarely saw their grandchildren. In September, the year that I joined PepsiCo, my 82-year-old widowed mother suddenly became nearly blind. This time, I followed my values. I resigned from PepsiCo, not wanting to be 3,500 miles away from her ordeal. To PepsiCo management's credit, they were understanding and helped me to disentangle fairly quickly. Would I have made the same decision 20 years earlier? I don't know. But it was the right choice at that point in time and never regretted it, specifically if I look at things unfolding today. There's a saying, when one door closes, another opens. Not against working overall, but I just wanted to be near my mother. Then I was intrigued when Credit Suisse CEO basically called me and asked to assess their procurement team and consider business process outsourcing. To determine the right approach, I did what I normally do. I analyzed all numbers, interviewed all procurement employees, and that was only 220, so it was not that difficult to do, and spoke with all internal customers. It became clear that the bank's procurement team, like many financial institutions, was far behind what I was accustomed to. Another example, again, of multiple temporalities, where practices normal in some industries are completely unknown in others. I developed a transformation metaphor for them, which was called twin engines. That's the reason why this airplane is there on the slide, to help the bank and its procurement staff to see the benefit. Moving from a single prop engine, which is internal, to a twin DPO engine, where you have the internal team and an external team to get much more torque. After a competitive process with 3 suppliers from 3 continents, Credit Suisse was, at the end, a global bank. We choose ChainIQ, a BPO provider focused on financial industry in Switzerland, for all places. We had it run against IBM and Genpact at that point in time. We transferred most personnel and processes to them, and which dramatically increased Credit Suisse buying power by integrating it into the ChainIQ's broader client portfolio. The project raised an fundamental question for me, coming from manufacturing. How do you drive excellence in a function deemed completely non-core, which it is? Procurement and many other of these commercial functions, accounting, whatever it is, they're completely non-core in a bank. When your function isn't central to the organization's value proposition, how do you maintain performance and motivation? I learned that non-core functions often require more innovative approaches and even central operations. As one executive said in the bank, if we're not getting to invest in you, we better figure out someone who is going to do it. Now, my recent chapter involves, after I said goodbye to corporate life, after nearly 40 years, established Helmig Advisory AG, which focused on greenhouse gas emission reduction strategies, supply chain optimization, I could do that with my eyes closed, and operational transformers. My objectives were to earn income with the advisory services while giving back as well training and advice to small and medium-sized companies, which are called KMUs, for example, in Switzerland, that normally couldn't afford someone with my experience. From my initial career-based focus, I wanted to combine my operations knowledge with a purpose in mind for years. I worked on sustainability and ESG activities for most of the last 20 years, but was utterly frustrated by not seeing the necessary impact to address what I believe is humanity's greatest long-term threat, which is climate change due to greenhouse gas emissions. So I began the doctoral studies here at UBIS, and the more I learned and researched, the more I shifted my advisory focus and podcast content. I have a podcast that I do called the Supply Chain Dialogue since 2.5 years. I'm nearly finished now, and with my dissertation defense hopefully this month, I learned a lot, and I'm tremendously grateful for all the professors who taught me here and my fellow students that, like Allah, were with me the whole time. I plan to share my quantitative findings in academic journals, and if everything goes right, write as well a book about the research that I've done. Now, from all of this stuff that I've talked about, let's talk about what I believe is insights for emerging leaders from that perspective. And I see that in 2 different contexts. One is the macro context of leading. Yeah? So one's have geopolitical awareness. I was recently at the dinner with about 20 top executives here in Munich, shortly after the so-called Liberation Day in the US. I was just absolutely amazed how ignorant most of them were about coming changes. They might lead massive organizations, but will always be reactive with their leadership style. So they did not understand what was really going on there, which was astonishing. Then sustainability. How could anyone in their right mind not work on it? No lip service or small gestures, because if you have the opportunity, turn the wheel. It's one of these disruptive forces we discussed earlier, and this is going to be with us for the foreseeable future. Then have a short-term and long-term balanced view. You probably work like everyone else in businesses or governments with shareholder meetings, elections, and so on and so on. So there is a certain tact rate that you have to follow and comply with. So my advice here is you have to feed the immediate beast to ride a unicorn in the long term. And then there is disruption, disruption, disruption. The black swans are now appearing in flocks. So learn to handle them. Companies operate in markets no longer as steamboats or sailing ships. They are whitewater rafting canoes. Learn the skills needed to stay on top, and it can be fun, like what whitewater rafting actually is. For the AI and the geopolitical changes, don't be the hare frozen before the snake. Prepare, develop skills, and choose jobs that let you weather this gigantic change. And it is coming, whether we like it or not. So, second, the personal contest. Accept that you need to balance between body, mind, and spirit. And this is not difficult because body means buy a fitness device and do sports. Exercise with others. It will help you later in life when you maintain friendships through sport and not necessarily work, because this will go away. Mind, use your work to keep your mind focused, but find something else as well. Chess, reading, meditation, yoga, audiobooks, whatever your fancy is. And spirit, and whether you call it now finding a North Star, connecting with core purpose, align with your deepest values, whatever it is, or contribute to something larger than yourself, just do it. Because that is going to keep you balanced when you have a career overall. Now, next we have we over me. I haven't seen a leader, or very few leaders, that were able to get up and do a career by talking about me, 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 me. It is all about we. And when you talk about we, there are much more people that are happy to share with your success rather than talk about yourself. And stay humble while you do it. Whether it's the cleaning lady that is coming when you sit at 8 o'clock still at your desk, coming by, or the guy that basically opens the door to you to the building, they all have a function in the company. So there is no reason that you treat them any different than you would like to be treated. Then listen, listen, listen. My grandmother said, Daniel, 2 ears, one mouth. There is a reason why you have it. And you probably have heard that as well. So it is so much better to actually take the time and listen to others. And you can look at this as well in a more academic or Greek philosophy sense. Thesis from the outside, antithesis from yourself gives you synthesis. Yeah. And then finally learn relentlessly. Even when you're done here, the learning just has started or continues. And that's something that I've done every month. I read 2 to 3 books on business. The best way to get in contact with me or have a good chat was, hey, Daniel, what kind of book are you reading right now? Or tell me about another book that I should read. And hence, I'm not going to go through this here right now, but I put together the books in leadership and culture that I think are brilliant and that I read from time to time again. The little link that you see there is actually to a podcast episode where I describe all the books. And then in my neck of the woods, it's IT, operations, and supply chain. The best books that I've seen over the last 40 years are there. There are much more, but these are the ones that I like. And with that, thank you for your attendance. And I as well open it up for eventually questions.
Well, thank you, Daniel. And that was a fascinating journey through your corporate career. If you don't mind, Femina, may I ask the first question?
Please go ahead.
Sure, doctor. Please go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Okay, and this is one of the things I love about this. Daniel, you in your presentation, you referenced Jim Collins' Good to Great a number of times. So One of the things that he talked about was was it level 5 leader, and the humility aspect is pretty profound in that. One of the leaders that impressed me a lot was Carlos Ghosn from Nissan. And I know he has fallen from grace a little bit, largely, but one of the things that resonates with me through your talk is the experiences that Ghosn had. If you're not familiar with Carlos Ghosn, he was the CEO of Nissan for quite a while, quite a number of years. He was Lebanese by birth, grew up in Brazil, went to university in France, and then was parachuted into Japan with no understanding of the culture, the language, or the people, and took this company, Nissan, which was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, and turned it around and back into profitability in 3 months. I feel that he's very much one of these guys that comes in and is very good at doing turnarounds. And I believe, perhaps in hindsight, that he should have hung his spurs up, as we say, when he had achieved the outcome of getting the company back into profitability. But he hung in there. He had kind of grand visions. You referenced Ford doing 1 million cars per year, and I believe it was what you mentioned. He was going to try and beat Toyota and the Volkswagen Audi group by doing 10 million. What's your thoughts on his career? You've been in the industry. What's your thoughts on his downfall? A long intro to the question, but I would love to hear your thoughts. And the point I'm making was, one of the things that seemed to be very prevalent with him at the beginning was humility. And maybe he lost that.
Yeah, he was an interesting character, but as well, similar the CEOs in other automotive areas, specifically from the large companies as such. I've seen as well, I don't know about how you think about it, but I've seen a lot of excellent leaders which were actually humble when they joined the CEO position and became complete, well, drivers in a direction nearly completely autocratic in the way that they were dealing. The guy that was running for 10 years there, ABB, who actually hired me and was the CEO later, we were, at the beginning, we were friends. And later on, he completely changed, maybe because no one, very few people, are telling you from time to time, well, maybe you're wrong. And that is terrible. So if you have absolute power, it corrupts as well, absolute, as they say. So that might be an issue from that perspective. The other topic is the average CEO career in most of large businesses is between 3 to 4 years.
Right.
If you go over that shelf life, something, I mean, there are exceptions to the rules, and there are some people that are staying there for 20 years, but 3 to 4 years is normal. After that, they normally are ousted due to something that changed, and the stuff that they were good at the beginning, suddenly the market changed and they were not coming up with the right instruments. That's my opinion. That's whatever it's worth.
It was really interesting because, and your points are very, very valid. One of the observations about him was that when he was at Nissan, all the young junior engineers would give a presentation to him every year. And at the beginning, he was very responsive, was making notes, engaging. By the time the corporate jet was involved and he was, managing both Renault and Nissan, there was observations that he was always on his phone. He wasn't paying attention. These guys, young guys, had worked really hard to do a presentation, and he wasn't even paying attention. And that was a pretty profound change in the way in which he engaged with the workforce, which was pretty telling, really.
Happens a lot, unfortunately. I've seen so many CEOs that turn from good into Dark Vader.
Yeah, amazing. Well, really interesting, and sorry for monopolizing the thing. I'm sure there's other questions, so let's open it up to a few questions, please. Machidu, I think you have a question, and then maybe Azahar. Rashida, go ahead.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you, Daniel, for such a wonderful presentation and for such an illustrious career. My name is Pilot. I'm studying CEOs and what makes them successful. So it was quite an honor to have your presentation. So I would want to know from you, from your career, what would you attribute the success that you have had in your career for 40 years? What would you say, maybe one or two things that stands out to say, this thing, I think this is what made me to be successful in what I did. Thank you.
It's a great question. I mean, you have your own design in terms of why you came where you went to. I think for me, there are two things that I regard as important in my career, which are really not that special. The first is I was starting not as a manager. I was earning my living at the beginning to really understand. I worked my way up. I understood nearly everything that I was doing before. I was leading before. I had to do it myself. I knew how that felt like. So that made it easier. The second thing is I worked bloody hard. I worked absolutely hard. And that was maybe something which I learned from my father. So um, when everyone was going home, I was still working. Now, is that a good thing? I don't think so, because as I mentioned, I did not the best job overall from a family perspective. I mean, thankfully, my sons still talk to me and my wife still hopefully loves me, but it was a hard time.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pilot. Thank you so. Sorry, I should have recognized you when I didn't. Forgive me. Azahar, I think you had a question.
Yes, Daniel, thank you for, it's an amazing journey, and really, it's really good that you documented it in that manner. The thing I wanted to ask you was that you spent a long time in Ford, and Ford went into decline probably, afterwards. And Alan Mulally came in and came up with a strategy which was based on simplicity, and his leadership. He published a book maybe 3 or 4 years ago called Relentless, something to do with the clarity and alignment, and he believed that would equal to performance. It's brought Ford back to some extent, but do you think more could have been done with his strategy? And I just want to give a reference to, I read a lot of Ken Blanchard's stuff, and he comes up with this SCORES high performance organization style of leadership. I don't really want to go into great detail, but I think there was something you concluded with, which covers a lot of the elements of this
Thank you.
strategy. But
Yeah.
two things which perhaps didn't come up. One was a compelling vision and the energizing of the system. So you covered a lot of the other things. So going back to my question, Alan, Mulali's, simple strategy, was it too simple? Could it have done more? Or, what's your view on that?
Now, from my perspective, the former strategy was completely crazy. It was NASA's strategy to get to this huge, massive company with all sorts of brands and what have you. But as I mentioned, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Ford was a monolith, always had been, and it was proud as such. Now, when we tried to do everything else, and we had Mazda and we had Volvo and whatever, it did not gel with the organization. So Mulally did the right thing. He basically got back to the basics and put Ford where it should be. Could he have done more? I don't know. I think every time, and you probably as well know that you have as well a distinguished career, every time you listen to a leader who is mediocre smart, you can believe that that might work. Yeah, but if you do not align the strategy with the culture of what you're doing, and you're not willing to change the culture, you end up with a crash. And that happened with NASA, so therefore Mulally did the right thing. And I think Ford is on a good way. I mean, they were the only company that was not needed a governmental bailout in the financial crisis. You know, GM and everyone else did. So there is as well a reason for that, which again resides in the culture of the company, because many were talking about the fact that Ford was actually an accounting firm that just by accident produced cars. They had their numbers under control, and that helped. I hope that answered at least my opinion. This is my opinion on your question.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for giving up your time on Sunday. I think this has been a really fascinating presentation. As you can see, Daniel is very active with his own podcasts. I would highly advise you to encourage you to go and check those out as well. They're really, really interesting with some really phenomenal observations. And we'll keep you updated on his journey to publication. I want to say a really very sincere thank you, Daniel, for giving up your time as well to come in and spend this hour with us and share insights and observations. Thank you so much.
Thank you for taking the time with me.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. Have a great rest of the week.
Thank you.